On a crisp, snow-dusted Christmas Eve in Charlotte, North Carolina, the soft glow of golden string lights illuminated the grand brick driveway of the Hayes estate, where luxury SUVs and polished German sedans lined the curb like symbols of carefully curated prosperity. I stepped out of my dark charcoal Ford F-150, a 20-year-old truck with a noticeable dent on the tailgate that I had never felt the need to fix, and pulled the collar of my coat close against the biting winter air. The coat was a simple, dark brown wool jacket, noticeably worn at the elbows and showing fine, neat repair stitches along the left cuff, where my late mother, Eleanor, had mended it decades ago. To the casually observant eye, I was merely Evelyn Vance, a 38-year-old single mother who kept a quiet profile in a modest suburban home and worked as a senior legal risk advisor for a defense technology firm. Few people who looked at my unassuming attire would ever suspect that for nearly 18 years, the men and women under my command had addressed me as Lieutenant Colonel Vance, or that my military career had been forged in high-stakes special operations and Army Criminal Investigation Division assignments across global conflict zones. I had spent nearly 2 decades navigating the intense pressures of military command, bearing the heavy weight of operational accountability, before choosing an early transition to safeguard a peaceful, grounded life for my 18-year-old daughter, Clara. I loved the anonymity of civilian life, finding a deep, quiet sanctuary in the fact that no one at local grocery stores or neighborhood gatherings knew about the combat commendations in my desk drawer or the complex strategic operations I had directed. Standing in the cool night air before stepping onto the grand stone porch, I took a slow, grounding breath, taking comfort in the knowledge that true strength never requires public performance, and that the quietest person in a room often carries the deepest reservoir of inner peace. The crisp mountain breeze rustled the evergreen branches above, whispering a gentle reminder that my true identity was firmly anchored in character rather than applause, completely protected from the judgments of those who measured human worth solely by material display. Inside the residence, the air was warm and heavy with the rich scents of cinnamon, roasted turkey, and freshly cut pine, filled with the gentle melodies of classic holiday carols playing softly in the background. My daughter Clara greeted me with a radiant, affectionate hug near the foyer, her smile bright with the pure, unburdened joy of a young woman preparing to step into adulthood. Moments later, 26-year-old Julian Hayes walked over, holding a crystal glass of aged scotch, his expensive Italian leather shoes clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor. "Merry Christmas, Evelyn," Julian said, his tone carrying that smooth, practiced familiarity he had adopted ever since his commercial real estate firm had begun landing multi-million-dollar regional contracts. His eyes briefly drifted downward, taking in my worn brown coat with a subtle, polite flicker of disappointment, before he offered a tight, condescending smile. "You know, it's freezing outside tonight. You really ought to let Clara help you shop for a modern winter coat one of these weekends." Clara's cheeks flushed with sudden embarrassment, and she quickly stepped in, her voice gentle yet protective. "Mom loves that coat, Julian. It belonged to Grandma." Well, everyone deserves an upgrade eventually, especially when family milestones are coming up. I simply offered him a mild, unbothered smile, remembering the humble young man who had first come to my kitchen 2 years ago, carrying a homemade pie and asking polite questions about my small backyard garden. Over the past 24 months, rapid financial success had slowly transformed Julian's character, replacing his initial humility with a performative arrogance that judged people by valet parking, luxury timepieces, and net worth estimates. He had begun speaking to service staff with a sharp, impatient condescension, while looking around my home with quiet pity, assuming that my simple lifestyle was the unfortunate result of a modest military pension, completely oblivious to the reality that genuine dignity is never measured by the price tag on one's clothes. True wealth resides in the quiet integrity of a soul that needs no external validation, a reality that Julian's superficial ambitions had completely blinded him from understanding as he navigated his comfortable world. As dinner drew to a close and dessert was served on fine porcelain plates, the light holiday chatter began to quiet down, giving way to an expectant stillness. Sitting across the long oak dining table, Julian's 60-year-old father, Marcus Hayes, a seasoned, highly successful commercial investor whose sharp, perceptive eyes had spent the entire evening observing every detail without offering shallow small talk, quietly stood up from his chair. Marcus walked to the carved mahogany sideboard, retrieved a thick white envelope, and slid it smoothly across the polished wood, letting it come to rest mere inches from my coffee cup. Printed neatly across the center of the envelope was a single word: family. Julian leaned back in his chair, folding his arms with a confident, triumphant smirk that suggested he believed an important victory had already been secured. Clara looked at the envelope, then at me, her joyful smile slowly fading into a look of quiet, anxious confusion. "I think it's best for everyone if we settle these practical details before the wedding," Julian announced, his voice carrying a practiced, authoritative rhythm that filled the quiet room. His mother lowered her wine glass with a polite, neutral expression, watching my face to register my reaction. I reached out and opened the heavy paper envelope with steady, unhurried fingers, pulling out a stapled stack of formal legal documents. The top page bore a prominent, unyielding heading in bold lettering: Prenuptial Property Agreement. For 2 full minutes, the only sound in the elegant room was the crisp rustle of turning pages as I read through the dense legal clauses. Across the table, Marcus remained completely motionless, his unblinking gaze fixed entirely on my face rather than on his son, watching my expression with a quiet, intense scrutiny that suggested he was testing something far deeper than a routine premarital contract. He was observing how a former officer handled an overt display of financial dominance, searching my features for any sign of anger, embarrassment, or fear, completely unaware that a woman who had faced real operational crises would never be rattled by a stack of legal paper. He watched the deliberate calm in my breathing, realizing that the quiet woman sitting across from him was analyzing the situation with the cool precision of a veteran commander who understood the terrain better than anyone else in the room. Beside me, I could feel Clara's posture grow rigid, her fingers knotting together in her lap as she stared down at her plate, her heart breaking under the sudden, uncomfortable weight of the room. She hated conflict, and the unspoken implication that our family was being viewed through a lens of financial suspicion hit her sensitive spirit like a cold wind. Clara knew that I was a retired military officer. She had grown up respecting my service, admiring my discipline, and knowing that I had spent nearly 2 decades wearing the uniform of a lieutenant colonel in defense of our country. She was immensely proud of my career, but what she did not know, because I had deliberately chosen never to burden her with it, was the true scale of the financial foundation I had spent years building for her future. Having raised her as a single mother while navigating demanding military assignments, I had deliberately kept our daily life simple, grounded, and free from material excess. I wanted my daughter to develop an unshakable inner character, to pursue her education in early childhood psychology out of genuine passion rather than entitlement, and to learn that a person's worth is forged through integrity rather than inherited wealth. She had no idea that behind our modest suburban life lay a carefully structured estate, robust investment portfolios, and comprehensive educational trusts that I had established long before she ever met Julian. Seeing her sit there now, silently fighting back tears because she believed her mother was being publicly patronized and judged as a financially struggling pensioner, touched the deepest maternal instincts within my heart. Yet, I remained completely calm, placing my hand gently over hers beneath the table, giving her fingers a reassuring, grounding squeeze that silently communicated that her mother was entirely in control of the room. In that quiet gesture, I transferred my own unshakable peace to her anxious heart, anchoring her spirit against the storm of unearned arrogance that filled the dining room. I wanted her to feel that true protection does not require a dramatic scene, but flows naturally from a quiet, unwavering confidence that no false accusation or patronizing document can ever diminish. In that heavy, suspended silence, my mind drifted briefly across time to the quiet memory of my mother, Eleanor, whose wisdom had anchored my life long before I ever put on an officer's uniform. Decades ago, while wrapping simple Christmas gifts in our small living room, Eleanor had shared a piece of quiet insight that had stayed with me through every deployment and strategic briefing. Evelyn, if you ever truly want to understand a person's character, let them believe you have nothing. People will always show you exactly who they are when they think they hold all the power. Standing in high-level command positions had taught me that aggressive posturing is the universal currency of the insecure, whereas true authority operates in absolute stillness, patience, and meticulous observation. I did not feel a single flicker of personal offense or anger toward Julian. My years as a military criminal investigator had trained me to view human behavior with detached, analytical clarity rather than emotional volatility. Julian's arrogant performance and his mother's polite pity were not insults to my dignity. They were merely diagnostic indicators of their own narrow worldview, revealing how completely they conflated material display with human value. I calmly folded the legal pages back into the thick envelope, laid it neatly beside my cup, and rested my hands loosely on the table. Across the room, Julian looked almost amused by my composure, assuming that my quiet silence signaled passive acceptance and financial intimidation. He had misread the room entirely, mistaking a veteran commander's patient observation for weakness, completely unaware that the quietest person at the table was simply gathering evidence, evaluating the terrain, and preparing to deliver a profound lesson in truth, dignity, and the true meaning of family. The entire room hung in a delicate, breathless balance, waiting for the first word to break the heavy stillness, completely unaware that this moment of tension was about to be transformed into a profound, irreplaceable lesson in love, character, and true redemption. The agreement had been meticulously drafted by a high-end commercial law firm, its dense clauses designed with surgical precision to insulate Julian's expanding real estate holdings, corporate equity, and future commercial ventures from any potential marital claim. It itemized his investments down to the smallest detail: his vacation condo in Myrtle Beach, his liquid asset accounts, and his projected partnership buy-ins over the coming decade. However, when my eyes reached the section detailing Clara's financial profile, the tone shifted into an almost patronizing legal dismissal. Her net worth was estimated at less than $80,000, consisting entirely of her modest personal savings account and an old sedan, describing her financial entry into the marriage as essentially empty-handed and dependent. Sitting across from me, Julian's mother offered a gentle, sympathetic nod, her eyes reflecting a blend of maternal protection and polite pity. "We felt it was best for both families to be completely transparent from the start, Evelyn," she murmured softly, taking a delicate sip from her crystal wine glass. "It's simply about protecting what Julian's father and I have built over a lifetime of hard work, especially in uncertain times like these when people are forced to manage on fixed military pensions. I looked at her with a calm, unbothered expression, sensing no personal malice in her words, only the quiet, patronizing assumption of someone who had been allowed to believe a convenient fiction. Julian nodded in agreement, leaning forward with his elbows on the table, convinced that his clever legal maneuver had established a clear boundary of domestic dominance. He truly believed he was shielding his growing empire from a struggling single mother and her daughter, completely oblivious to the fact that the financial numbers on that paper were not a reflection of reality, but a monument to his own shallow assumptions. I felt no urgent need to interrupt or correct them, knowing that truth possesses a quiet, patient weight that never needs to shout to prove its existence. Across the table, Marcus Hayes remained completely still, his hands folded neatly over his cloth napkin as he studied his son with a quiet, unreadable expression. Unlike Julian, who was practically radiating a sense of self-satisfied victory, Marcus looked at the scene before him with a subtle, underlying sadness that only a parent could truly recognize in their child. Over the past several months, Marcus had watched his son's character slowly erode under the weight of sudden commercial success. He had seen Julian stop calling his aging grandmother after she moved into assisted living, noticed how Julian complained about family gatherings that lacked expensive catering, and cringed as his son made cruel jokes about former college friends who chose public service over high-paying corporate roles. Marcus had not suggested this premarital agreement to isolate my daughter. He had quietly approved its presentation tonight as a deliberate, controlled test for his own son. He wanted to see whether Julian had become so consumed by financial posturing that he would weaponize a legal document to patronize an honorable family on Christmas Eve. Sitting under his father's sharp, analytical gaze, Julian had no idea that he was walking directly into a mirror designed to expose his own spiritual poverty. Marcus had spent 40 years building a legitimate fortune through hard work and integrity, and it broke his heart to watch his son treat money as a weapon to demand subservience from others. As I met Marcus's eyes across the dining table, a silent understanding passed between us. A shared recognition between two mature parents who understood that unearned arrogance is the most dangerous trap a young person can fall into. Marcus was not sitting there as my adversary. He was sitting there as a deeply concerned father, waiting anxiously to see if his son possessed enough residual humility to learn the profound lesson that was about to unfold in this room. He watched his son's theatrical confidence with a heavy heart, hoping that the quiet strength sitting across the table would ignite a spark of genuine self-reflection before it was too late. With the calm, methodical precision I had developed over 18 years of analyzing complex legal evidence and tactical operational briefings, I looked up from the document and met Julian's expectant gaze. From a purely legal standpoint, Julian, this agreement is exceptionally thorough, I said, my voice low, even, and entirely devoid of emotional heat. However, as a legal risk advisor, I feel obligated to point out a fundamental flaw that your attorneys seem to have completely overlooked. Julian blinked, his confident smile wavering slightly under the quiet weight of my voice. A flaw? What kind of flaw? He asked, trying to maintain his authoritative tone. I rested my forearms lightly against the edge of the table and leaned in slightly, grounding the atmosphere. Under North Carolina marital property law, presenting a complex 4-page premarital contract on Christmas Eve without offering the bride independent legal counsel or sufficient time for a neutral financial audit creates an immediate presumption of procedural duress, I explained calmly. If this document were ever brought before a family court judge, it would be declared legally unenforceable within 5 minutes, simply because you attempted to use a holiday gathering to force a hasty signature. Julian's face flushed a sudden, uncomfortable red as he glanced nervously toward his mother, completely unprepared for a technical legal analysis from a woman he had dismissed as an uneducated pensioner. He opened his mouth to offer a rehearsed counterargument, but the steady, unblinking authority in my eyes silenced him before he could speak. I was not raising my voice or displaying anger. I was simply laying out objective legal reality with the cool detachment of a veteran commander reviewing a faulty battle plan. Beside me, Clara let out a quiet, subtle breath, her posture easing as she realized that her mother was not being cornered or overwhelmed. Julian had expected an emotional outburst or a tearful surrender, but instead, he found himself standing on thin ice, realizing that his grand tactical display had succeeded only in exposing his own profound lack of preparation. Looking at my daughter's relieved expression, my thoughts drifted back across 10 years to a cold, overcast afternoon when Clara was only 8 years old. Her second-grade classmates had all received shiny, brand-new bicycles with fancy gears and bright neon paint for the holidays, and Clara had come home from school with a heavy, disappointed quiet hanging over her young shoulders. Money had not been an issue for us even then, but my mother Eleanor and I had deliberately chosen to purchase a second-hand bicycle from a local church charity drive. The frame had a few noticeable scratches. The front basket was slightly crooked, and the original paint had faded under years of sun. When Clara saw it resting in our garage, her eyes had filled with quiet tears as she asked why she couldn't have a new bike like everyone else. My mother had knelt beside her on the cold concrete floor, taking her small hands with gentle warmth, and said words that would echo through our lives forever. Clara, we are giving you this bike because we want you to learn a vital lesson before the world tries to teach it to you the hard way. The people who truly love you will care about how fast you ride and how bright your smile is, not whether the paint on your handlebars is shiny. People who judge you by the shine on your toys will always abandon you the moment the paint begins to fade. A week later, Clara had come running through the front door with a beaming smile, declaring that her best friend had spent the entire afternoon riding behind her on the handlebars without caring about the scratches. Sitting at the Hayes dining table 10 years later, I saw that same deep, enduring wisdom reflecting in Clara's eyes. She had grown into a mature young woman who understood that human worth is never found in a showroom or a legal clause, completely unbothered by those who sought to measure her value through a spreadsheet, holding fast to her inner dignity. Setting the legal document down beside my teacup, I reached into my bag and brought out a small, carefully wrapped Christmas gift that I had brought for Julian. It was a modest, rectangular package wrapped in simple brown paper and tied with a piece of natural twine, completely lacking the glossy foil and oversized silk bows that decorated the other presents under the Hayes tree. I slid the package gently across the table toward Julian, offering him a warm, sincere smile that completely dissolved the lingering tension in the air. "Open it, Julian," I said softly. "It's something I made for you." Julian hesitated for a moment, his fingers trembling slightly as he untied the twine and folded back the brown paper. Inside lay a hand-carved wooden keepsake box, crafted from dark, rich American walnut, its smooth surface shimmering under the chandelier lights with a deep, natural luster that no factory finish could ever replicate. I had spent nearly 3 weeks in my small workshop, shaping the wood, hand-sanding every joint, and sealing it with natural oils until the wood grain flowed like liquid silk. Julian ran his fingers across the seamless corners, searching for hidden nails or metal hinges, but found only the precise, interlocking dovetail joints of a master craftsman. He looked up at me, a sudden, genuine flicker of wonder breaking through his defensive posture. You made this yourself? He asked quietly, his voice losing its arrogant edge. I enjoy woodworking, I replied gently. It teaches you that true structural strength comes from patience, alignment, and taking the time to fit pieces together correctly without forcing them. Across the table, Marcus leaned forward, his sharp eyes examining the flawless joinery with deep, professional respect. My grandfather was a cabinet maker, Marcus whispered softly, his voice filled with an old, reverent warmth. He used to say that you can always tell the character of a builder by looking at the joints they hide beneath the surface. In that quiet moment, something profound shifted across the room as the simple, unpretentious beauty of a handcrafted wooden box exposed the hollow nature of the paper contract sitting beside it. I reached down into my modest leather shoulder bag, unzipping the side compartment with the quiet, practiced motion of someone who had spent decades keeping critical documents secure under all operational conditions. I pulled out a weathered leather ID binder, the very same holder that had accompanied me through international deployments, tactical briefings, and official military inquiries across multiple continents. Without a single word, I unclasped the brass snap, opened it, and gently slid my retired military identification card across the polished mahogany table until it rested directly beside the prenuptial agreement. Julian's confident smirk flickered for a second, replaced by mild curiosity as his long fingers picked up the laminated blue card. He glanced at my photograph, then at the bold, official crest of the United States Department of Defense, before his eyes locked onto the centered line directly beneath my name. Lieutenant Colonel, United States Army, retired. A sudden, heavy stillness settled over Julian's face, the color draining from his cheeks so rapidly it looked as though someone had pulled an invisible curtain over his vitality. He blinked once, twice, staring at the embossed military seal, as if trying to reconcile the formidable rank with the quiet, 38-year-old woman sitting before him in a mended wool coat. Lieutenant Colonel? Julian whispered, his voice cracking slightly on the second word, losing every ounce of its former theatrical polish and smooth corporate confidence. Across the table, his mother reached out with a trembling hand, adjusting her reading glasses to peer at the card, letting out a sharp, audible breath when the truth registered in her mind. Clara sat up straighter beside me, her eyes widening in a mixture of awe and dawning pride as she looked from the card back to my face, seeing her mother not as a vulnerable, struggling pensioner, but as a decorated officer who had commanded elite personnel in defense of the nation. The atmosphere in the dining room transformed instantaneously, the previous air of patronizing condescension evaporating under the immense weight of an unshakable military legacy. Every detail on that card, from my official service number to the embossed Department of Defense seal, stood as silent testament to years spent making critical life-and-death decisions, making the patronizing premarital agreement look utterly insignificant by comparison. Before the room could fully process the weight of my military credentials, Julian looked up, his eyes wide with a desperate, disoriented confusion as his mind struggled to assemble an entirely new narrative. So, you have a military pension? He managed to ask, his voice raspy, hesitant, and completely stripped of its former swagger. How much does a retired officer even make? Marcus frowned at his son's immediate turn to monetary figures, opening his mouth to reprimand him, but I raised my hand gently, offering a clear, precise response that completely dissolved the lingering financial assumptions in the room. My military retirement pension as a senior officer with nearly 18 years of service and combat-related command adjustments comes to approximately $18,000 a month, adjusted annually for federal cost of living allowances, I explained in a calm, matter-of-fact tone. And the remaining $10,000 a month that enters my primary account flows from a long-term, low-cost index fund portfolio that my late mother Eleanor and I disciplined ourselves to build over 30 years of quiet, consistent investment. The silence in the dining room became absolute, so heavy that the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer sounded like a rhythmic hammer against the wood. Julian's mother set her wine glass down so abruptly that a small drop splashed onto the crisp white tablecloth, her eyes wide as she realized that my monthly passive income alone exceeded what many corporate executives earned after decades of ladder climbing. I looked directly into Julian's eyes, offering no smugness, resentment, or petty triumph. Only the unshakable clarity of a woman who had built her security on patience, sacrifice, and disciplined planning, rather than flashy commercial leverage or superficial bravado. True financial freedom is never about boasting or keeping score, but about creating an unyielding fortress of peace that allows a family to live with dignity and independence, regardless of external storms. The sudden realization that my quiet lifestyle was a deliberate personal choice rather than a financial limitation completely shattered Julian's narrow worldview, forcing him to confront the staggering depth of his own ignorance. He sat there, speechless, finally understanding that true security requires no external performance or public applause. Reaching back into my leather binder, I removed a second thin packet of official documents bound neatly in blue legal covers and laid them softly on top of Julian's prenuptial draft. These are the certified summaries of the irrevocable family trust that I established 3 years ago, shortly after my transition from active service, I stated gently, addressing both Julian and his parents with quiet composure. Clara looked at the papers curiously as I turned the first page, revealing the official seal of our family's estate planning firm. Under the terms of this irrevocable trust, our suburban home, the lakefront property in western North Carolina, and the primary investment portfolios are held entirely in trust, with Clara designated as the sole, unalterable beneficiary, I continued, my voice infused with maternal warmth and unshakable authority. In addition, the trust fully funds her higher education through graduate school, provides a substantial housing endowment upon her graduation, and secures dedicated charitable funds for pediatric mental health initiatives. Clara gasped softly, covering her mouth as her eyes filled with warm, overwhelming tears, not because of the staggering material value of the estate, but because she suddenly realized how deeply, fiercely, and silently her mother had spent years shielding her future from every imaginable storm. The patronizing line in Julian's contract estimating Clara's net worth at less than $80,000 now lay exposed as an absurd, ill-informed fiction. My daughter was not entering this marriage as a needy dependent relying on a wealthy family's generosity. She was walking into her future backed by an unshakable fortress of financial security and maternal foresight that no arrogant legal document could ever diminish or claim. Every dollar in that trust had been placed there with love, discipline, and purpose, ensuring that Clara would never have to compromise her dignity or values for material survival in an uncertain world. This trust stood as an unbreakable fortress, designed to protect Clara not only from life's financial uncertainties, but also from the predatory arrogance of anyone who might mistake her gentle nature for weakness. It was a tangible expression of a mother's eternal commitment to her child's peace and independence. Julian sat completely frozen in his leather chair, staring at the trust documents as if the solid ground beneath his feet had suddenly dissolved into thin air. The artificial superiority he had cultivated all evening, the condescending jokes about my worn winter coat, the patronizing offers to help with my expenses, and the calculated display of legal dominance had collapsed under the undeniable weight of reality. He looked at Clara, then at me, his posture slumping inward as his chest heaved with shallow, erratic breaths. In less than 10 minutes, the quiet, humble woman he had treated like an impoverished pensioner had been revealed as a decorated former military commander, possessing financial independence and strategic foresight far exceeding his own commercial real estate firm. The psychological shock was absolute. It stripped away the performative armor he had worn for 2 years, leaving him completely exposed as a young man who had mistaken volume for authority and material display for character. Beside me, Clara sat tall and composed, her initial anxiety completely replaced by a quiet, dignified strength that mirrored my own posture. She did not taunt Julian or offer bitter words. She simply looked at him with a profound, mature clarity, seeing her fiancé clearly for the first time, without the romantic illusions that had previously blinded her. The dynamic in the room had inverted entirely, not through a shouting match, a dramatic scene, or a bitter display of anger, but through the quiet, unyielding power of objective truth. True strength never needs to posture, roar, or demand applause. It simply stands firm, immovable, and peaceful, allowing the illusions of those who seek to dominate others to shatter against its unyielding foundation. Julian sat stripped of his arrogance, forced to confront the stark contrast between his superficial ambition and the deep, silent substance of the woman sitting across from him. He was experiencing the painful, necessary collapse of an ego built entirely on unearned privilege and superficial appearances, realizing too late that real respect cannot be bought with luxury timepieces or corporate titles. The illusion had shattered, leaving only the quiet, immovable reality of genuine character standing in its place. The heavy silence was finally broken when Marcus Hayes slowly stood up from his chair, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the polished dining table under the soft chandelier light. He did not look at me or Clara. His sharp, sorrowful gaze was fixed entirely on his son, his face contorted with a profound, heartbreaking disappointment that cut far deeper than any harsh reprimand. I asked our corporate attorneys to prepare that premarital agreement, Julian, Marcus said, his voice low, steady, and carrying the cold, heavy weight of an absolute truth. Julian blinked, looking up at his father in sudden, disoriented surprise. You did, Dad? Julian stammered, his confidence completely shattered. Yes, Marcus replied, leaning his hands on the table as he looked down at his son. And I didn't do it because I believed Clara was coming into this family empty-handed. I did it because I watched you change over the last 2 years, Julian. I watched you stop calling your grandmother in assisted living. I watched you mock service workers. And I watched you judge people by their cars and timepieces. I approved that envelope tonight because I desperately needed to know whether my own son had become so blinded by his modest success that he would treat an honorable family with arrogance and pity. Julian flinched as if he had been struck, his face turning pale as his father's words dismantled his remaining pride. You introduced an extraordinary woman into this house tonight, as if she were someone who needed your financial saving, Marcus continued softly, his voice trembling with genuine grief. You looked at her mother's mended coat and saw poverty, completely blind to the dignity, service, and wisdom standing right in front of you. Marcus turned to me, offering a deep, respectful bow of his head. acknowledging a fellow leader who understood that real character is forged in service, humility, and truth. In that solemn moment, Marcus's public rebuke transformed the room from a battleground of financial posturing into a sacred space of moral reckoning, setting the stage for a young man to finally confront his flaws and begin the long, difficult journey toward genuine maturity and redemption. Julian stood up slowly from his seat, his heavy footsteps echoing against the polished oak floorboards as he walked toward the front entryway where my worn winter coat was hanging. He reached out with trembling, hesitant fingers, lifting the old brown wool jacket from its wooden peg as if handling a fragile, irreplaceable artifact. Carefully, almost reverently, he carried the coat back into the dining room, holding it gently in both hands, like a mirror he had spent years trying to avoid. "I am deeply ashamed," Julian whispered, his voice shaking under the weight of an emotion he could no longer suppress. He looked down at the mended elbow seams, the fine stitches my late mother Eleanor had sewn with steady, loving care decades ago, and let out a soft, self-deprecating laugh that was completely devoid of bitterness. "I looked at this coat tonight, and I genuinely believed it told me everything about who you were," he continued, forcing himself to look up and meet my eyes. "I thought it was proof that retirement had caught up with you, that you were struggling, and that my family needed to save yours from poverty. It never once crossed my mind that this coat wasn't revealing your story at all. It was telling me who I was." No one in the room moved. That single, honest admission settled over the dining room like fresh, quiet snow, stripping away the remaining layers of Julian's superficial ego and exposing the vulnerable young man beneath. Marcus nodded slowly from the head of the table, a gentle flicker of pride returning to his sorrowful eyes as he listened to his son finally speak with unvarnished, authentic humility. For the first time in 2 years, Julian was not acting for an audience or performing for a corporate camera. He was standing bare-chested before the truth, allowing the quiet dignity of a mended coat to shatter his shallow illusions. He held the coat close to his chest, realizing that the true measure of a person lies not in the luxury of their garments, but in the quiet strength and enduring love woven into every thread of their character. Walking slowly over to my side of the table, Julian carefully laid the brown coat across the back of an empty chair, his hands lingering on the fabric for a moment, as if anchoring his newfound composure. He turned to face me, taking a deep, shuddering breath before lowering his head in a gesture of profound, unpretentious remorse. "I owe you an apology, Evelyn," he said softly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I judged you by your truck, your clothes, and your quiet lifestyle, completely blind to the incredible leadership and sacrifice that built your life. I am so sorry for treating you with pity when I should have offered you my deepest respect." I looked up into his flushed, humbled face, feeling a warm, maternal surge of compassion wash through my chest, entirely free of lingering resentment or defensive anger. I smiled faintly, my voice infused with gentle, grounding warmth. "Try again, Julian," I murmured softly. He blinked, looking momentarily confused as his brow furrowed. "What?" he asked softly. "You've been calling me Evelyn with a polite, distant formality for almost 2 years, I reminded him gently, reaching out to place my hand over his trembling fingers. He swallowed hard, his throat tightening as a tear finally slipped down his cheek. Then, for the very first time since Clara had brought him into my life, he whispered with raw, authentic sincerity, "I am so sorry, Mom." Clara immediately burst into tears beside me. Not dramatic, anxious tears of heartbreak, but quiet, relieved tears that come after holding one's breath for far too long. I stood up and pulled Julian into a warm, firm embrace, holding him with the same grounding strength I used to offer young officers after a bitter failure, welcoming him into the sacred, forgiving circle of our family. In that quiet embrace, the lingering distance between us evaporated, replaced by an unshakable bond forged in genuine humility, grace, and mutual understanding that would sustain our family through every coming season. I felt his shoulders relax as he held me tightly, releasing the heavy weight of expectations he had carried for far too long, finally stepping into a space of true acceptance and belonging. When we finally sat back down around the table, the atmosphere in the room had transformed completely, the former coldness giving way to an intimate, healing warmth. Julian reached toward the center of the table, gently resting his hand near the hand-carved walnut keepsake box I had crafted for him. He traced his thumb over the carved inscription inside the lid, reading the words aloud in a quiet, reverent tone. Family isn't built by money. It's built by showing up. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a quiet, earnest desire to understand. How do you spend 18 years serving at the highest levels of military command, building a secure legacy, and still live as though none of the titles matter? I smiled warmly, leaning back in my chair as I offered him the quiet truth that had anchored my own journey after military service. Because once you step away from the uniform, Julian, none of those titles do matter, I explained gently. When I retired, I realized that my medals would eventually sit in a glass display case. My rank would become a line in an archive, and every dollar my mother and I accumulated would eventually belong to someone else. The only thing that truly endures in this life is how we treat the people who cross our path, and whether we showed up with love when they needed us most. Julian listened intently, nodding slowly as the profound truth settled deep into his heart. "I've been running someone else's race," he admitted softly, glancing at his father with sudden clarity. "I spent so long trying to prove I was successful that I forgot how to be a good man." I rested my hand on his shoulder, offering him a smile of unshakable faith. Recognizing that truth, Julian, is where real leadership begins. True success is never measured by what you accumulate or the applause you receive, but by the quiet peace, integrity, and genuine devotion you bring into the lives of those you love most. It is the character you build when no one is watching, and the selfless choices you make day after day that define the true legacy you leave behind for generations to come. Later that evening, after the dinner dishes had been cleared, and Clara and Julian sat together on the living room sofa, speaking in quiet, reconciled whispers, Marcus and I stepped out onto the back porch. The crisp December air greeted us, carrying the clean, sharp scent of pine and fresh snow, while golden holiday lights reflected softly off the quiet yard. Marcus stood near the wooden railing, holding a steaming mug of black coffee, looking out into the peaceful darkness with a thoughtful, reflective expression. "Thank you for not destroying him tonight, Evelyn," Marcus said softly, turning his head to look at me with profound, unspoken gratitude. "You had every right, as a former officer and a mother, to tear his arrogance to pieces in front of everyone. Instead, you gave my son his dignity back." I leaned against the railing beside him, watching our breath form gentle white plumes in the cold night air, feeling the deep, silent camaraderie that exists between parents who have weathered the heavy storms of raising children. "Destruction is easy, Marcus," I replied gently, my voice steady as bedrock. "Any commander can tear down an insecure soldier, but a real leader builds a bridge so they can walk toward redemption." "Julian isn't a bad young man. He was simply lost in the noise of a world that tells young men that volume is strength and wealth is character. Marcus nodded slowly, taking a sip from his mug as a soft, relieved smile touched his eyes. He was fortunate to cross paths with a mother who knew the difference, he whispered softly. We stood together in the quiet chill of the Charlotte night, two parents connected by a shared commitment to truth, grace, and the enduring sanctuary of family, watching the soft snowfall transform the quiet landscape around us into a clean, unblemished slate, leaving behind the heavy burdens of pride to embrace a brighter, unified future where two families could grow together as one. The quiet stillness of the evening enveloped us like a warm blanket, reminding us both that the greatest gift a parent can give to their child is the grace to fail, learn, and grow into a person of authentic character. When we returned inside to the warm living room, Julian was standing by the stone fireplace, holding the thick white envelope that had started the evening's confrontation. With steady, deliberate fingers, he opened the clasp, pulled out the prenuptial agreement, and systematically tore the 4 legal pages down the center, placing the scraps gently onto the glowing embers of the hearth. As the paper caught fire and turned to ash, Julian turned to face Clara and me, his posture straight, his eyes clear, and his demeanor filled with an unshakable resolve. I asked my father's attorneys to destroy the original draft this evening, Julian announced calmly. I don't want Clara signing a contract born out of fear or arrogance. When we write our estate documents, they will be built on complete equality, mutual trust, and shared purpose. He stepped closer to Clara, taking her hands in his with gentle, unpretentious warmth. In fact, I want to ask for something else, Julian continued, looking from Clara to me. I want us to postpone our wedding by 4 months. I don't want to step up to the altar as the man I was 2 hours ago. I want 4 months to work on myself, to learn from your mother, to visit the community, and to prove through my daily actions that I am worthy of marrying into this family. Clara looked up at him, tears of joy reflecting the golden firelight, and nodded her head in soft, loving agreement. I walked over and placed my hands over their joined fingers, feeling a profound, healing peace fill every corner of the room. The evening that had begun as a patronizing display of financial dominance had ended as a sacred sanctuary of truth, grace, and mutual respect, proving that when pride is stripped away, love always finds a way to build an enduring home where every heart is valued and understood, leaving us all transformed by the grace of a new beginning. As the quiet warmth of the crackling hearth illuminated our smiling faces, I knew that our journey was no longer about proving individual worth, but about walking together with open hearts in quiet strength and unshakable unity. True transformation is never measured by a single emotional conversation or tears shed in a moment of dramatic revelation. It is carved out day by day through quiet, disciplined choices made when no one is watching. 2 weeks after Christmas, Julian met with a neutral estate attorney to officially dissolve the previous premarital agreement and draft new estate documents that reflected complete equity, shared responsibility, and unconditional mutual respect between both families. More than that, Julian insisted on establishing a dedicated corporate philanthropic fund, the Evelyn Vance Military Family Initiative, directing a fixed percentage of his real estate firm's quarterly profits towards supporting military families navigating long deployments, financial strain, and mental health struggles. When he brought the finalized foundation papers to my kitchen table, laying them beside my morning coffee, he didn't boast or look for applause. Instead, he sat down quietly, his eyes clear and humbled, asking if I would serve as the advisory board chair to ensure every dollar directly served veterans in genuine need. I looked at my mother Eleanor's name printed on the official seal, feeling a warm, quiet lump rise in my throat as I realized how profoundly a single night of unvarnished truth had redirected a young man's heart. He was no longer trying to impress me or manipulate my daughter with grand gestures of superficial wealth. He was actively choosing to align his success with service, honoring a woman he had never met by caring for the military community she had loved so deeply. In that quiet kitchen, as the soft morning sun warmed the worn wooden floorboards, I saw a young man taking his very first confident steps toward authentic leadership, learning that real power is found in lifting others rather than standing above them. Every clause of this new foundation reflected a deep commitment to quiet service, proving that when wealth is guided by empathy and purpose, it can build lasting legacies that heal broken hearts, restore lost dignity, and bridge the gaps between disparate worlds. During those 4 months of postponed wedding plans, Julian made a silent commitment to walk alongside me on my monthly visits to the Regional Veterans Affairs Medical Center in downtown Charlotte. The first visit in early January was visibly uncomfortable for him. He stood stiffly near the doorway of the rehabilitation ward, unsure of how to interact with men and women who carried visible physical scars, lost limbs, and the quiet, heavy shadows of severe combat trauma. Seeing his hesitation, I placed a gentle hand on his arm and offered him a piece of advice that had guided my own command years ago. You don't need to perform or say anything clever, Julian. Just sit down, look them in the eye, and listen. He took a deep breath, walked over to an elderly Marine veteran sitting alone in a wheelchair, and simply asked about the faded unit cap resting on his lap. For the next 2 hours, Julian sat completely still, listening intently as veterans shared stories of lost comrades, birthdays celebrated over satellite phones, and the overwhelming quiet of returning home to a world that moved too fast. Driving back to my house afterward, Julian stared out the passenger window for a long time before speaking, his voice barely above a whisper. I spent years admiring people because they made a lot of money, he confessed, tears glistening in his eyes. I completely forgot to admire the people who sacrificed everything so we could live in peace. That weekly routine at the hospital transformed his perspective, stripping away his remaining superficial arrogance and replacing it with a deep, reverent appreciation for human resilience, sacrifice, and quiet service. Sitting among those brave men and women, Julian discovered a sense of purpose that no corporate victory or financial profit could ever provide. His journey through the hospital corridors became a sacred sanctuary of personal growth, teaching him that the highest honor in human life is found in serving those who have quietly borne the heaviest burdens for others. The changes in Julian's daily life were not confined to grand gestures or official foundation papers. They manifested in the quiet, unscripted moments that reveal a person's true character. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon in March, Julian invited Clara and me to lunch at the local steakhouse, where he had previously acted so impatiently toward an elderly waitress. As we stepped through the front door, Julian walked directly over to the same woman, whose name tag read Martha, and greeted her with a warm, respectful smile, asking how her knees were holding up after the busy lunch rush. Martha's eyes lit up with genuine warmth as she recognized him, chatting comfortably about our grandchildren before guiding us to our table with obvious delight. Throughout the meal, Julian treated her with the same attentive courtesy he used with his high-profile commercial clients, leaving an exceptionally generous tip tucked inside a handwritten note of gratitude. He began calling his aging grandmother every Sunday afternoon without fail, sitting on her porch for hours, listening to her repeat the same childhood stories, finding joy in her presence rather than viewing her care as a chore. One evening, Clara watched him pull his polished SUV onto the shoulder of a busy road to help an elderly man load heavy groceries into a rust-damaged car, stepping back into the rain with mud on his leather shoes and a quiet, contented smile on his face. No cameras recorded his actions. No social media posts broadcasted his generosity, and no audience applauded his kindness. He was simply becoming a man who showed up for others, out of genuine empathy and quiet integrity. Each small act of kindness became an invisible thread, weaving a new fabric for his life, proving that authentic redemption is built quietly, through everyday compassion, rather than loud declarations. His spirit had softened, allowing genuine love to replace the restless need for status and approval. One Saturday morning in mid-April, Julian arrived at my house, carrying 2 paper bags of breakfast sandwiches and hot coffee from the diner I visited every week. We sat together at my worn, wooden kitchen table, the morning breeze drifting through the open window, carrying the sweet scent of blooming maples from the backyard garden. Julian looked around the modest 1,200-square-foot home, the simple cabinets, the antique cookie jar, the mended furniture, and shook his head with a soft, reflective smile. For 2 years, I drove myself crazy trying to figure out why a decorated officer with your resources chose to live in this simple neighborhood, Julian admitted, setting his coffee mug down on the table. I walked into the hallway, retrieved a faded photograph framed in simple pine, and laid it gently between us. The picture showed my late mother Eleanor and my father standing in front of their very first home, their clothes simple, their smiles radiant with unburdened joy. That house cost everything my parents had at the time, I explained softly, tracing the faded edges of the photograph. They paid it off after years of hard work, but they realized something vital. The happiest years of their marriage happened before they accumulated very much. When I left the military, I didn't want to spend the rest of my life chasing things I didn't need, just to impress people I didn't know. I wanted to protect my peace, my home, and my time with Clara. Julian stared at the photograph for a long moment, nodding slowly as the truth settled deep into his spirit. "I've been running toward a finish line that doesn't exist," he whispered softly. "You chose a life that actually matters, rooted in peace rather than performance." The quiet stillness of my small kitchen embraced us like a warm blanket, sealing a profound moment of mutual understanding that transcended generations, titles, and wealth. He had finally found the courage to stop performing and begin living with authentic purpose and grounded peace. 3 weeks before the rescheduled wedding, Julian stopped by my workshop while I was hand-sanding a piece of oak at my workbench. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a small velvet box, and laid it gently beside my tools with an expression of quiet, nervous reverence. "I hope you don't mind, Mom," he said softly, "but I took something from your dresser last month." I opened the box to find my old military field watch, the very timepiece my mother Eleanor had given me 25 years ago when I received my commission. The crystal was still scratched, the green canvas strap was visibly faded, and the steel casing bore the subtle dents of deployments in harsh terrain. But when I held it to my ear, the internal movement ticked with perfect, rhythmic precision. "I brought it to a master watchmaker in Charlotte," Julian explained, watching my face carefully. "I asked him to completely service the mechanical movement inside, so it runs perfectly for another 50 years. But I made him promise not to buff out a single scratch on the casing or replace the strap." Tears filled my eyes as I ran my thumb over the worn canvas band, deeply moved by the exquisite thoughtfulness of his gift. "It still looks old, Julian," I murmured, my voice trembling with affection. "It should," Julian replied, with a warm, genuine smile. "Those scratches represent your service, your history, and your love for your mother. It would have been an insult to erase them. I stood up, wrapped my arms around his shoulders, and held him tightly, feeling the unshakable bond of family unite us completely. He had not attempted to upgrade or replace my past. He had learned to honor it, proving that his transformation was complete. In that quiet, sawdust-scented workshop, the lingering shadows of the past completely dissolved, replaced by a deep, enduring peace that assured me my daughter's future was safe in the hands of a man who had learned the true value of love, honor, and family. This was not the lavish, million-dollar resort wedding Julian had originally envisioned during his months of performative ambition. It was a quiet, intimate gathering held at the small country church where my late mother Eleanor had spent decades worshiping. The simple wooden pews were filled with a beautiful, harmonious blend of people from every walk of life. Veterans in crisp dress uniforms sitting alongside corporate executives from Marcus's firm, and local neighborhood shopkeepers chatting warmly with Julian's childhood friends. There were no assigned seating sections separating high-net-worth investors from working-class families, no flashing cameras recording the event for social media, and no artificial displays of luxury designed to command attention. Instead, the church sanctuary resonated with an undeniable, sacred presence born from genuine community, shared joy, and deep mutual respect. As the organist began playing the soft, melodic notes of the opening hymn, I stood near the stained glass entrance, looking across the room at Julian, who stood near the altar in a tailored dark suit, his posture straight, his eyes clear, and his demeanor reflecting the humble, grounded confidence of a man who had earned his place. Beside him stood his father, Marcus, whose face radiated a quiet, reverent pride that no commercial victory could ever purchase. In that stillness, I felt my mother Eleanor's spirit resting gently over our gathering, witnessing the fulfillment of a truth she had taught me long ago, that when love is anchored in humility and purpose, it creates a sanctuary where every human soul is received with equal dignity and grace. I wore an elegant, deep navy silk gown that reflected an understated, quiet dignity. But draped carefully over my left arm was the very same brown wool jacket, mended at the elbows with my mother Eleanor's fine, loving stitches, that I had worn on that tense Christmas Eve 4 months ago. I had brought the coat not as a reminder of past conflict or a silent taunt toward my future son-in-law, but as an irreplaceable family heirloom and a living symbol of the lessons that had brought our two families together. As I walked down the stone hallway toward the bride's room, Julian's mother approached me, her eyes glistening with soft, affectionate tears. She reached out, gently placing her hand over the mended sleeve of the brown coat, her touch filled with a deep, unspoken apology and a profound new understanding. "Thank you for holding on to this coat, Evelyn," she whispered softly, her voice trembling with genuine emotion. "On Christmas Eve, I looked at this jacket and saw a family that needed our protection. Today, when I look at these stitches, I see the quiet, unyielding strength that saved my son from losing his soul to shallow pride." I smiled warmly, placing my hand over hers, feeling the final remnants of unspoken distance dissolve between us like morning mist. The coat had transformed from an object of condescending pity into a sacred emblem of grace, reminding every person in that church that true value is never found in the pristine sheen of expensive garments, but in the faithful hands that mend broken things, and the enduring love that preserves a family through every season of trial. A few minutes before the processional music began, Julian stepped quietly out of the side vestry and walked down the stone hallway toward me, his steps unhurried, and his expression filled with a deep, serene reverence. In his right hand, he carried a small, velvet-lined mahogany box, holding it out toward me with both hands in a gesture of profound respect. Inside lay my old military field watch, its mechanical movement completely restored to flawless operational precision, while its steel casing retained every single scratch, dent, and mark earned across decades of military service and maternal sacrifice. I wanted to give this back to you before I take Clara's hand at the altar, Mom, Julian said softly, his voice rich with authentic warmth and emotional maturity. 4 months ago, on Christmas Eve, I mistook your quiet lifestyle for poverty, and I bowed down to your military rank because I was terrified of real strength. But over these last 4 months, as I watched you serve veterans, protect your daughter, and offer me grace when I deserved judgment, I learned what real authority looks like. He paused, taking a slow, grounding breath, as a tear slipped down his cheek. I don't just respect Lieutenant Colonel Vance, Mom, Julian whispered with raw, heartfelt conviction. I respect the extraordinary woman and mother you chose to become when you took off the uniform. I took the watch box from his hands, feeling my eyes fill with warm, grateful tears as I looked into the face of the young man who had walked through the fire of self-examination and emerged as a leader worthy of my daughter's trust. I strapped the worn canvas band around my wrist, its steady ticking echoing against my pulse like a heartbeat of shared redemption. When the double wooden doors of the sanctuary opened and the pipe organ transitioned into the gentle, soaring chords of the bridal march, the entire congregation stood up in breathless, joyful silence. I walked alongside Clara down the center aisle, holding her arm firmly as she moved toward the altar in a simple, stunning white lace dress that radiated pure, unburdened elegance. Clara looked up at me, her bright eyes reflecting a profound mixture of maternal gratitude, deep happiness, and absolute peace, knowing that her mother had built a fortress of love around her life that no storm could ever shake. Standing at the foot of the altar, Julian stepped forward to meet us, bowing his head slightly in a gesture of quiet, reverent gratitude, before reaching out to take Clara's hand into his own. As I gently placed my daughter's hand into his, I looked directly into Julian's clear, steady eyes and saw an unshakable promise, a vow carved not in legal clauses or premarital contracts, but in the quiet, tested furnace of genuine daily character. Take care of each other, I murmured softly, my voice steady as bedrock. Build your home on truth. And never forget that love is proven by showing up. As they turned together toward the minister to exchange their wedding vows, a profound, healing peace washed over my heart. The journey that had begun with a patronizing white envelope on a cold Christmas Eve had culminated in a sacred covenant of equal partnership, mutual respect, and unyielding devotion, proving that when pride is stripped away, love always builds an enduring home that shelters generations to come. Later that evening, after the joyful reception had ended and the last guests had departed under a canopy of starlight, I returned alone to my modest 1,200-square-foot home in Charlotte. The house was quiet and still, filled with the familiar, comforting scents of fresh cedar, lavender, and my mother's old recipe books resting on the kitchen counter. I poured a warm cup of coffee, walked out onto the back porch, and sat down on the wooden rocking chair that my father had built 40 years ago. The cool night breeze rustled the maple leaves in the yard, carrying the sweet fragrance of night-blooming jasmine across the porch as golden moonlight bathed the quiet neighborhood in a serene, peaceful glow. I looked down at my wrist, feeling the steady, rhythmic ticking of my restored military field watch against my skin, its scratched steel casing catching the silver moonlight like a ribbon of quiet honor. I thought back over the long road that had brought us to this day, the operational deployments across distant conflict zones, the quiet sacrifices of single motherhood, the tense confrontation over a premarital contract, and the beautiful, transformative redemption of a young man who had learned to choose humility over status. A soft, contented smile touched my lips as I took a slow, grounding sip of coffee, feeling a deep, unshakable peace settle into the very depths of my soul. The greatest victory in human life is never outproving who is right, asserting power over others, or winning an argument. It is about having the courage to stand firm in truth while holding open the door of grace so that others can find their way home to who they were always meant to be.